Dr. Joel Hunter here with you today. Wow, 2016, can you believe it? And we're going to be talking about your second quiz today. And that quiz covered natural law theory and desire satisfaction theory. I want to talk about the results of that. I've got a few questions I want to go over with you from that quiz and try to debug them a little bit and give you some advice and tips about some lessons to learn from that quiz that you can carry forward to the next quiz, which you've got three different sections, three different normative theories to cover this time. You have ethical egoism, which is chapter 8. Then you have consequentialism, which is 2 chapters, 9 and 10. And then you have the Kantian perspective, which is chapters 11 and 12. So you got a lot of reading this week, and hopefully you've already gotten a start on it. And so half of the presentation today, I want to talk about things to focus in on that amount of reading. So I have some tips for you about areas that I'm drawing a lot of questions from and some areas that I'm not drawing as many questions from, and I want to give you some help with that. Okay, so just as a reminder for those of you here, if you are if you're in the class and you have questions about anything that I'm going over, it's live and interactive, so you can simply type in a question or make a comment, and it comes up on my screen and everybody else's screen who's tuned in. So feel free to do that. And if at any time there's something that you appreciate or that you want to say, yes, thank you very much, you can double tap your screen and that sends hearts, which that just expresses, hey, I'm glad you're saying this, thank you, etc. So any of those ways of interacting is fine, but of course questions are always welcome. So at any time during this presentation, if you have a question, just fire it in. What would help me, because sometimes your handles are different than your actual name, is if you lead your question by writing out your name first. So capitalize your name and then type your question. So that's the only ground rule really for what we're doing today. And I'm in a different studio today than my normal one, and it's a little darker. It's kind of cavey like, but hopefully that won't be too distracting. I've got a light over there. You can see it kind of shining on the screen, but hopefully that won't be too distracting. Also, last week, as you know, I had Periscope issues where I was broadcasting from last week. It was just kind of sketchy with the internet connection. So it was pausing and messing up. Hopefully today we won't have that issue. I've tried to take steps to avoid that. But if it does, I'll do something similar like I did last week, which hopefully you were able to get useful information from the screencast that I did as a substitute for the Periscope. So hopefully for those of you who tuned into that, that's satisfied. Okay, well, let's get right to it. I want to go ahead and start with the autopsy on your second quiz. Let me find my clicker. Here we go. Pardon me. Okay, so let's talk about some of the questions. And again, I like to highlight ones that people struggled with, or the majority of students struggled with, or a significant number of you struggled with, because oftentimes that gives me a clue as to what's not sinking in or what isn't clear, maybe even problems with some of my questions. And I want to do some of that with you today and talk about, again, I've done this in the previous sessions where I've tried to highlight things to, sort of dangers and traps and things like that, things to avoid. And a lot of it comes down to close reading and taking your time and being careful. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that today. But let's go ahead and get started with what was a series of questions, questions 8 through 11 I want to start with, because these in particular had kind of surprising results. So let's take a look at question 8, and I'm just going to look over here because that's where my screen is and I can read it. I can't read backwards. Okay, if there are things that are beneficial to us, that contribute to our welfare, but aren't things that we wanted or desired, then that would be evidence that the desire satisfaction theory is mistaken. Okay, so this question, 64% of you got it correct. So this was under the average on the quiz, which by the way was 78 or 79%. So actually a very solid showing on the quiz. So this one was interesting because you underperformed, the class underperformed versus the overall average on the quiz. So I was curious to see what was going on with that. So this, the answer to this one is true, and the answer is to be found on pages 44 through 45. And the key here is that desire satisfaction theory, one of the advantages is it's really simple and straightforward. And desire satisfaction theory claims that the only thing that is beneficial for us, the only thing that is a good, is to have our desires satisfied. So if there are other things that are good for us, that it turns out are good for us, that are in our welfare, that are beneficial to us, if there are other things than satisfied desires, then that is a strike against desire satisfaction theory, and that's what this claim is saying. So that is why this one is true. Okay, so you can look on pages 44 to 45 where this question comes from to get that corrected if you aren't sure about it. Okay, next, question 9. In this one, I've highlighted a term that I highlighted on your actual quiz too, because I want to say something about it. So let's read the question first. If I derive pleasure from a desire whose satisfaction is not in my interest, but could be in the interest of a stranger, a friend or pet, or even in no one's interest at all, then that is beneficial to me. Okay, so this question is asking you to look at that statement and say, hey, is this consistent, logically consistent with desire satisfaction theory? And just a reminder about what consistency means. It means that that particular statement in the quotes and desire satisfaction theory can both be true at the same time. Okay, that's what consistency means. So is this consistent or not? And the answer here is no, it is not logically consistent. And there's two tells on this one that will give you an idea of why it's not consistent, or two, I guess you say two reasons that it's not. Number one is that is the term pleasure. Okay, so that's kind of a red herring, and a red herring is a distraction. If you derive pleasure from a desire, that right there, stop right there, because that is irrelevant to whether or not it's good for you, because desire satisfaction theory does not recognize that there is anything at all intrinsically valuable that is valuable in and of itself. So it doesn't matter whether it's pleasurable or not. If it is the only thing that matters, the only thing that is good, the only thing that's beneficial is if your desires are satisfied. Okay? Not if you get pleasure from them. So then that's number one. That's tell number one. Tell number two is where it's talking about the satisfaction of others. So desires that others have and that then I meet. Right? So a desire whose satisfaction is not in my interest, but in the interest of a stranger. Okay, that is tell number two of why this is not consistent with desire satisfaction theory. Because desire satisfaction theory only recognizes the good, only recognizes good in your own, that is self-regarding desires, not desires that are other-regarding. Okay? So that's the reason that this is false. There's two reasons, really, in this question of why, or in this statement, as to why it is not consistent with desire satisfaction theory. Okay, so that's question number 9. Ready to go on to the next. This is one of those argument questions that I gave you a heads up about in the last time that we talked. And so I give you an argument here. And just I want to skip down to the bottom of the argument. You can read the 3 points there. The question that you're asked is, this argument is logically consistent with the desire satisfaction theory. So it's a true-false question. So this is very similar to the previous question. It's asking you whether something is consistent or not with desire satisfaction theory. Okay, so the answer here is yes, it is. It is consistent with desire satisfaction theory. If you look on page 54, then you'll see essentially this very argument laid out. So just looking at the specific claims here, there are two areas that might be reasons that you would have said false. One has to do with the first claim and the feelings of disappointment. Desire satisfaction theory, though, does not guarantee any particular feelings as a result of getting your desires satisfied. There's nothing to prevent those desires, there's nothing to prevent those satisfied desires from producing feelings of elation and euphoria or disappointment and depression. That part, the feeling part of the argument is actually irrelevant to desire satisfaction theory. So yeah, a desire satisfaction theorist could look at claim number one and say, yeah, sure, we can satisfy the desire we most deeply care about and feel disappointed. Sure, we sometimes do feel let down. Okay, so let's look at proposition number two, or premise number two, and see if there's an issue there. It is morally irrelevant whether one feels enjoyment or misery as a result of having one's deepest desire satisfied. Now, this too might have thrown you off if you were still thinking hedonism, because that sounds like something that a hedonist would care about. Indeed, a hedonist would care about that because a hedonist cares about pleasure, enjoyment, and reducing misery, reducing pain. So that item number two, though, is consistent with desire satisfaction theory because it is morally irrelevant, again, whether you experience pleasure or misery as a result of having your satisfied desire. Because desire satisfaction theory isn't concerned with those feelings, it's concerned with what's good for you, what is beneficial to you, what produces well-being. And you may feel bad, but what produces well-being is going to be satisfied desires. Okay? So that's, in a nutshell, those 8, 9, and 10 were, I wouldn't say tricky true-false questions, but here's the really interesting thing about this. Each of those questions had a 64% correct answer rate. So it's like the same people answered those questions wrong, and the same people answered them right. I was really stunned by that. That there seems to be something related, and I don't know whether it's a confusion with hedonism or whether it's sort of missing the key point of desire satisfaction theory. I don't know what the reason is, but there was pretty clearly a relationship there between these three questions, given that exactly 64% of you got them right. So in other words, 36% of you got them wrong. Okay, so let's go to the next one. Now this one, 57% of you got this one correct. So this is getting closer to, there's something squirrely going on here with our grasp of desire satisfaction theory. So let's look at this. Desire satisfaction theory allows that what is valuable in its own right. That is, valuable independent of one's desire for it. Okay. Now, I've already said that desire satisfaction theory is really straightforward and simple because it says only the satisfaction of one's desires is what matters. It's because that's all that's good for you. That's all that is beneficial to you. So the answer here is nothing. There is nothing that is valuable in its own right, according to desire satisfaction theory, which, by the way, is why it is a subjective theory of value and not an objective theory of value. It does not recognize that there is anything independent of your desire that is beneficial to you or good for you. So you can put all those things in, plug all those things in there, and desire satisfaction says, nope, that is not necessarily what's good for you. Nope, that is not, knowledge is not valuable in its own right. Nope, pleasure is not, etc., etc., etc. So if you look on pages 45 and 58, you'll see there a discussion of the answer choices. Because that list I pretty much took from the things that the author pointed out, like, no, desire satisfaction theory does not allow that any of these things are intrinsically valuable. Okay, so that was question 11. So let's go, now I'm going to jump to question 18, and now we're into natural law theory. And I want to look at a few of these as well. Now this was an interesting one, question 18. So let me just jump again to the question or the statement that is this is a true or false. So according to the author, since this argument expresses what all natural law theorists hold, this is why there are no agnostics or atheists who are also natural law theorists. So is that statement true or false? So, and I give you this argument above to sort of lay out that position that all natural law theorists are theists. So, and and so that would be exclusive, right? That if so, then natural law theory is it's not only consistent with theism, but only theists accept natural law theory, that agnostics and atheists don't. This statement is false, okay? And the giveaway is that underlined portion there, that phrase, since this argument expresses what all natural law theorists hold. But it doesn't. And the reason it doesn't is because mainly because of item number 2 and 3. So there's a discussion on pages, first of all, page 77 lays out the fact that no, natural law theory does not entail theism. There are plenty of atheists and agnostics who are also natural law theorists. It looks for human nature in something other than what is created by God. So in theism, natural law theory is based on this idea of the imago Dei, the image of God that is given to humans. All right, it's what makes us like the divine. But obviously, if you're not a theist, then you would not hold to that view, right? So where then does human nature come from? Well, that's an interesting question. And there are these different models of human nature that's discussed in your text. None of them, by the way, have to do with theism. So that is why this answer is false, is because there are other models of how humans acquire their nature that do not depend on theism. Okay? So look on pages 77 and 83 for the answer there. And the argument, although the argument is valid, it makes an improper inference because of premise number 3 in particular is not something that natural theorists hold, that all natural law theorists hold. Okay, so I'm stumbling over my words. I think I might be going too fast here. Gosh. Okay. All right. So let me see. Half of you, only 50% of you, going back there. 50% of you. Oops. Let me see here. 50% of you got this one wrong. So half of you said true, half of you said false. And although natural law theory is consistent with theism, or most kinds of theism, not all, but most kinds of theism, it isn't implicated, it isn't entailed by theism. It doesn't require theism. Okay. So yes, moving on then. Now, this was the one I warned you about in last week's video. I wanted you to look carefully at the difference between conceptual and empirical truths. And here's the question. So I gave you in the quiz, if you remember, I gave you one statement that was an empirical truth. It had to do, I think, with you taking the quiz right now, right? So it's empirical because the truth of it is determined by the information you get from your senses, right? And then there was a conceptual truth question, which I think was some mathematics statement. So the mathematical law, it's not the senses that give you or that validate or confirm the truth of the statement, but it's the ideas themselves and their relationship to each other. So you had one of those. And then I throw this one at you, which is the moral question, right? So let's look at this one. Natural law theory, according to natural law theory, it's wrong to engage in the recreational slaughter of another human being, that's the quote, is an example of what kind of truth? All right, so the answer here is empirical. Now, there's a very good reason that some of you missed this one. Many of you, in fact, over half of you, 61% of you said neither instead of empirical. But the key information in the question is that opening phrase, according to natural law theory. So this one, I'm actually going to open my book with you, and I'm going to look at this because I think that I can pinpoint exactly where you misinterpreted either the text or the question, or you overlooked this part of the question. So starting on page 78, let's see if I can find it. Yeah, it's at the bottom where he's talking about empirical truths. Suppose we agree with the plausible claim that all knowledge is of either conceptual or empirical truths. If that is right, and if moral claims are neither, then moral knowledge is impossible. Okay, there you go. He says that it's plausible that moral knowledge is impossible because moral claims are neither conceptual or empirical. That's assuming that all knowledge consists of conceptual and empirical truths. So he's entertaining that as a hypothesis. And the reason he's doing that is because he's setting up this discussion of David Hume, which he just mentioned. And he goes on to page 79 and fleshes this position out. And this is where he gets into the is and ought distinction, that just because you have empirical facts or knowledge of the world does not mean, or even mathematical knowledge, conceptual truths, does not mean you can infer moral rightness and wrongness from facts. So that's the is-ought distinction. So this is what he's talking about here. On page 79 at the top, he says, and this is a rhetorical question, why aren't moral claims empirical truths? Because we don't discover them by means of our senses. Okay, now if you stopped there, it's perfectly understandable why you said neither, because that appears to be what the author is saying. But the author, at this part of the text, is only reporting a particular moral position of the particular moral position that insists on the is-ought distinction, and specifically that of David Hume. If you stop there, or if you only look at that, then you think, well, that's the answer. But then you look at the question and it says, according to natural law theory. And you don't get that answer until you read a little further after the discussion of David Hume. And he says this is about 2/3 of the way down the page. Natural law theory claims to be able to solve Hume's challenge. According to the theory, moral knowledge requires two things. We must know what our human nature is and know whether various actions fulfill it. Natural law theorists think that both kinds of knowledge are empirical. There you go. So we can know right and wrong with empirical knowledge. That's the claim of natural law theorists, and that's where your answer comes from. So it's on page 79, but it's understandable that many of you said neither there, but that is not the correct answer. Okay, sorry for that long discussion, but I thought that was helpful. I thought that would be helpful to you because I wanted to illustrate, even just by reading from the text myself with you, how you have to be cautionary here. So here's a point I would make, and I was thinking about this. This isn't the question. Actually, let me just go to the next question. I'm going to make this point, so I won't forget. I promise. All right. Whoops. So the next question is question 23, and this is the one about Hume. Okay, so the philosopher who argued that there is an uncrossable gap between claims about what is the case and claims about what ought to be the case was David Hume. So that's your answer. And that too is on page 79, just the same page we were just discussing. Okay, now here is the point I wanted to make about this one. Another fact about this particular question was 82% of you got it correct. Now notice how close that is to the average on the entire quiz. 79%, 82%. This question really predicts what the overall average is on the quiz. Here's what this tells me. This question shows me that approximately 20% of you are not reading the text closely enough. Now this question in particular is one that I would say you would get right from a cursory reading. Now, cursory means that you actually have done the reading, you might have underlined some things, you might have caught some things, but you haven't really tried to internalize it, you haven't really grappled with it, you haven't thought about it. Okay, and close reading, because what you're doing in close reading is asking questions and interrogating the text and the author, requires you to spend more time and digest it and to understand it. And so close reading is highly predictive of you getting this correct. So I would say there's 80% of you who are likely doing close reading, but I know there's at least 80% of you doing cursory reading. So I know that many of you have actually read the text. So this tells me, there's about a fifth of you in the class who aren't really doing the reading or aren't really doing it with any kind of concentration or focus. Okay, so that's what this tells me. So I'd like to see that 20%, become 0%. I want to see everybody at least do the complete reading and have a better shot on the quiz. But what I would like even more is to see close reading and see that kind of engagement that's going to get you, from the 80% range into the 90% range. Okay, so that's the end of my little lesson there. So, all right, let's look at a couple more here from quiz 2, and then we'll get on to quiz 3. All right. Consider the following argument and its evaluation. Okay, this was a bit of a tricky question, and I'm rethinking the scoring on this question, and I'll say why in a moment. So let's look at this. This is also this is a multiple choice question, and I'm asking you which of the premises is the trouble with this argument. Okay, and because I'm already telling you this is a poor evaluation of the argument, and so which premise is the problem, or is it the inference from the premises to the conclusion that's the problem? So let's look at this. Look at it closely. Since humans are animals, it is in our nature, that is human nature, to behave as other animals do. And what you want to do when you're analyzing an argument is you want to think about not just if a claim is contestable, which most claims are contestable, but you want to ask, is there something obviously off about this? Or is there something that makes it likely to be false? Is there some fallacy in the statement? You want to look for those premises and hone in on those when you're doing an analysis of an argument. Which ones create the most, which statements or statement creates the largest problems for the argument. Okay, so in that first one, it's so general that it's hard to say whether there's a problem or not with it. It's certainly contestable, right? So if we think of things like involuntary actions, all right, so humans and other animals seek food. Okay, yeah. Humans and other animals, especially mammals, scratch, right? So involuntary actions like that. So there are clearly behaviors that humans and animals share. Now, is that statement saying more than that? Well, it could be, but it kind of depends on what you couple with it, what you make, if you put an and with it. And you do that in an argument. So I want to show you which one creates the problem for premise number 1. But on its own, premise number 1 is not obviously false. It's not obviously fallacious. It may not be well worded. It may not be well thought out. It's so general. But that's not necessarily bad. That's not necessarily, a deal killer for an argument. So here's another one. Let's just get a little more controversial with it. Some animals, especially the higher primates, do things like carry out raids on nearby tribes and murder their rivals. Well, humans do that kind of violent behavior too. So we do sometimes behave like maybe some of the more disturbing things that we see in nature. But also some of the higher primates have been known to exhibit what we would call altruistic behaviors. That is, they risk themselves, they risk their lives for another member of their group, or even for an animal that is not in their group. There's a famous case of a chimp doing this for a little girl, a little human girl, and that's curious behavior. So it seems like even on the plus side, that animals and humans, at least some animals and humans, share a lot of similarities when it comes to behaviors. So now let's look at premise number 2 and see what's going on there. Animal behavior, because it is natural, is morally acceptable. Okay, now here we have something that sounds a lot like what natural law theorists claim, which is, what is morally right is what is done in accordance with one's nature. But here's the problem with this claim. It's talking about animal behavior. It's not talking about human behavior in particular. It's talking about animal behavior. And the problem here is that that ignores the importance of moral agency. And natural law theorists require this concept of moral agency, or in fact, most ethical theories do, because we have to be able to figure out, who is morally responsible for their actions and who is not. We want to assign things like praise for good behavior, and blame for bad behavior. So if there's no such thing as moral agency, then it makes no sense to do those things, or it's arbitrary. Okay, but animals are not moral agents according to ethical theories. Okay, now I'm saying that as a blanket statement. There could be exceptions, but I'm saying as far as we know. So add that parenthesis. As far as we know, no other animals are moral agents. And so you look in your text for a definition of moral agents. So this is the problem here. It makes no sense to attach the idea of an action being morally acceptable or unacceptable to animal behavior. It only makes sense to attach it to human behavior. And so the best answer to this question is that premise 2 is false. Premise 2 is false. Page 77 goes through this discussion of moral agency, and how premise 2 just is not something that natural law theorists hold. And by the way, that's the key to getting this, is again that phrase there in the problem statement here. Since natural law theorists accept the truth of the premises 1 through 3, but they don't accept the truth of premise 2. In fact, they would deny that premise. Okay, premise number 3, just to wrap it up and do a complete job of it, is some animals kill or eat their own young. Well, that's true. I mean, that's an easy empirical fact to know. Okay, so 3 is not a problem. 2 is definitely a problem. 1 is kind of iffy, and so a number of you, 50, in fact, half of you said that premise 1 is false or fallacious. But it's only false or fallacious if you conjoin it with another claim, like number 3. And that might be what was going on with those of you who chose answer choice number 1, is that you were thinking of the specific example of specific behavior of killing and eating your young. But that's not what premise 1 on its own says. Okay, so be careful of that. And limit, when you're doing analysis, limit your analysis to the specific premise, one at a time. But anyway, I wanted to spend a little time on this one, not only because it was a one that a lot of you missed, but because it was a good example, a good exercise for how you do an argument analysis. Okay? So I want to pause there for just a second and see if there's any questions on this one. And, oh, by the way, I was going to say, I'm rethinking the scoring in this one because, the premise number 1 is not well stated. I don't think it's the best answer to the question. I think premise 2 is pretty clearly the false one, according to natural law theory. But I can kind of understand why some of you would have chose premise 1. So I might throw in a half point credit on that one for those of you who chose answer choice 1. I'm saying might, and I shouldn't say might. I either will or I won't I? So I'm going to say I will on this one. Okay. Number next, and this is the last one in our autopsy of quiz 2. This is one that I was kind of disappointed to see the performance on this, and only 46% of you got this one right. And I'm not sure whether it was not heeding my warning in the previous video. When I went through, I alerted you to this specific question in the previous video. So that tells me probably only half of you, watched the whole video or, paid attention, maybe you went and got a drink or something while that section was rolling. But this particular one was addressed in the video. So the question asks or says, the natural law argument and the argument from humanity show that definitions are of absolutely no use for gaining clarity about the subject matter of morality. Okay, the answer to this is false. This is explicitly denied on page 89, where the author says, actually, definitions are very good, are very important for helping us gain clarity about what we're talking about the subject matter. What definitions are not any good for is solving moral problems on their own. They don't do that. I mean, we have to make arguments to do that. We have to reason to do that. We can't just throw around, we can't make moral problems go away by redefining terms. You know, lots of people like to do that. That's called BS. That's the technical term for it. But there's a tell in this question also. I threw this in precisely because I wanted to, give you a hint, I guess, this is the best way to put it. And that is, I threw in a superlative. I put in absolutely. Remember what I said last time about superlatives like this, is that all it takes is one exception, one counterexample, and it's false. Okay, so when you use a term like absolutely, you're going out on a limb, and you're making a claim that's very hard to defend. So even if you weren't sure about this one, you could have said false on this one just on the basis of the likelihood that this was extending way too far a claim with that word absolutely. So it turns out it's just plain false. It is of use. Definitions are of use precisely about gaining clarity about what we're talking about. Okay, so that's quiz 2, folks. And now I want to go over to quiz 3 and talk about some things for you to prepare. Let me get my next notes out as I turn there. Those aren't my notes. Hang on. Those are my notes. Yes. Indeed they are. Okay. Now, as I warned you last week, this is the week where the reading load becomes more intense. And so you have 5 chapters in your text to read this week. And more importantly, you have, I would say, one fairly accessible and easy normative theory to grasp, and that's ethical egoism. Very straightforward. And then I would say 2 more complicated theories to tackle, and that is consequentialism or utilitarianism. You can think of those terms as interchangeable, just for the sake of this reading. And the Kantian perspective. There's a technical name for his perspective. It's called deontological, but I won't use that term because your text doesn't use that term, and that's fine. It just know that this is a theory that comes from the philosopher Immanuel Kant in the 18th century. Okay, and early 19th century. So here's the structure for quiz 3. You have 8 questions from the chapter on ethical egoism. You have 16 questions from the 2 chapters on consequentialism. And then you have 18 questions from the chapters on the Kantian perspective. So that's 42 questions. However, there's 43 questions on your quiz, and that's because the very first question on your quiz is asking you to consider a particular moral problem and figure out, and it also gives you an assessment, about what's morally right or wrong about it. And then it asks you, okay, which theory makes this assessment? Which theory that we've read about is the one that would make this assessment of the moral problem, that would find a moral problem here. And so you have to choose from among the 4 moral theories, or from 4 moral theories that I've put on there. And what I've done is I've thrown a value theory in, hedonism, but then the 3 normative theories that you're reading about this week, each of those are answer choices. So you have to pick which one of the 4 then is the answer to that. And that's actually the very first question on the quiz. Okay. So, I wanted to make a general point. So I want to talk for just a minute and just remind you about what we're doing in this section with ethical egoism, actually with natural law theory too, but consequentialism and the Kantian perspective. We're now talking about normative theories. So we're talking about the category of right and wrong, of what makes choices and actions right or wrong. That's, we're looking for moral norms then to guide us in our thinking, our decision making, and our actions and behaviors, right? That's normative theory. Value theory has to do with an investigation of the good, of what is good versus bad, and what is, so in other words, what is beneficial to us, what promotes human welfare, valuable. So that is what value theory is about the good. Normative theory is about the right, if you want to put it in this most simplistic terms, just to keep those terms straight in your mind. Okay, so that was point number one, and then the general points leading to a general point about how we talk about ethical theory in general is this: make sure that you understand the difference between what a theory morally requires. So we're talking about right action and wrong action, right? So right action would be, so what a theory morally requires would be examples of what are the right actions according to the theory, and what is forbidden would be examples of actions that are wrong according to the theory. So when we apply the theory to a given ethical situation, a given moral problem, you can always ask, well, what does, say, consequentialism require me to do in this situation? Or what does the Kantian perspective forbid in this situation? So those are two important moral terms. The other is what is permitted by moral theory. So that is, not that it's morally required, but it's morally permitted. So this is, you would find this stated by the phrase or by the sentence, you may do something, you may do this, you may do that. All right, so you can find that language expressed in some common English words that we use all the time. You must do X, you must not do Y, you may do Z. Those kinds of things are talking about what's morally required, what's morally forbidden, and what is morally permitted. So keep that idea just in the back of your mind as you're reading through. Because what you don't want to do, and here's why I'm saying this, is you don't want to confuse with what a theory morally permits and what it requires. Because you may be making it more, stringent than it actually is. And vice versa. You don't want to take what a moral theory morally requires or forbids and say it's permitted, because then you're making it more lax, and it may not be. And one thing you'll learn about consequentialism when you read about that is that is a very, very strict, it has very high standards that you have to meet in order to be a moral person. If you're going to be a consequentialist, you're in for a tough go of it. It is not easy, and the same thing is true with the Kantian perspective too. I think this is why a lot of people like ethical egoism, because it seems a lot simpler. The moral requirements are much less in that, as we will see. Okay, so key points in Chapter 8 for ethical egoism is I want you to make sure that you understand the libertarian argument for ethical egoism. I have 2 or 3 questions from this section. So remember, there's 8 questions total from this chapter. And, so I'm giving you a heads up here that, at least 2, I think it's 3 though, come from the libertarian section. So make sure that you understand the libertarian argument for ethical egoism. Then I want you to look on pages 114 and following for the 3 problems with ethical egoism. So there are several questions. Let's see, probably 3 questions that come from that section as well. So that will help you. And then one of the questions in this section, I'm asking you to complete an argument. So this is kind of similar to the ones that I gave you on the last quiz, where I lay out an argument and then I give you an analysis of it and ask you either true, false, or that last one we did, a multiple choice question. This one's a little different, but I present you a formal argument that would be something an ethical egoist would argue. And what I do is I leave out a premise. And so it's a multiple choice question, and what I'm asking you to do is figure out which premise in the list that I give you is the one that would make the argument valid. Okay, so here's your warning about this. What it is not asking you for is whether you agree or disagree with the premise that you select from the list, nor is it asking you to agree or disagree with the argument. That's not it. What it's trying to do is get you to understand the concept of validity, to apply the concept of validity to a formal argument. And so what I'm asking you to do is to recognize which premise amongst a selected group is going to preserve the truth of the argument. So if true, if the premises are true, then the conclusion has to be true. And that's what you're looking for. Which of the premises, if it's true, is going to, guarantee that the conclusion has to be true. Okay? So just be aware of that. I want you to pick the premise that makes the argument valid, okay? Even if it's contestable. You may not think it's a very plausible claim, but it is the claim then that even if it's false, is going to be the claim that makes the argument valid. So it's about the argument structure, about finding the statement that preserves the truth of the conclusion. Okay, so hopefully you're getting some lessons here over these last couple of weeks on argument structure and what makes a good argument, bad argument. And I want to just make sure that lesson is sinking in, give you a different kind of problem for that. Okay, so now I want to get over to consequentialism and run through this list. Sorry, I'm creeping over here. I need to get over here so you can see the screen better. Okay, so in consequentialism, key term, and it's a weird term. It's one of those things that, in fact, it was a term until I had this book. I had never heard this term. True story. I'd never heard this term. I probably will never use it again outside this book. But it is actually a helpful term for understanding. It's a funny word that expresses a complex idea. I like those kinds of words. It's a lot more economical to find a word, even if it's an unusual word, and that you have to look up to express a complicated idea. And that's what optimific does. So make sure that you look on page 120, and I think it goes over to 121 as well, about the meaning of the term optimific and how it fits into consequentialist theory. Okay, next. Understand what utilitarianism is and how it relates to consequentialism. So I told you earlier that these two terms are basically interchangeable, and your author, alerts you to how he's going to be doing that in the text. He gives you, though, a formal definition for utilitarianism, and it follows right after he tells you what the principle of utility is. And so if you want to think of it as a Venn diagram or something, you would think of consequentialism is the big bubble, okay, big bubble, and then utilitarianism is a bubble inside consequentialism, right? So it's utilitarianism is a species of consequentialism. But for the sake of the rest of the questions, you really don't have to worry too much about the distinction between utilitarianism and consequentialism, because your author essentially interchanges them. Okay. Next, review the maximizing goodness section and the two misunderstandings. I cannot emphasize this enough. Pages 122, 123. I have two specific questions, but there's a third question too that comes from this section, and maybe another too. But there are two questions that I would call them reductive. In other words, they're questions that are almost true, but they leave out important information from them. Okay, so they reduce the full expression of a claim down to something that's only partially true. And so that's what you want to watch for in this section. And he calls them the two misunderstandings of consequentialism. And it has to do with maximizing happiness. So take a careful look at those and be alert that you're going to have those two misunderstandings as questions on the quiz. So I want you to get those. All right. Understand the role of intentions in consequentialism, and he discusses this on pages 125 through 6. Got a couple questions there about the role of intentions and how they are irrelevant to how consequentialists regard the morality of particular actions. It's not that intentions are not something that we should take into consideration, but consequentialists have a particular way that they do that. So they don't In other words, they don't find the morality of actions to be determined at all by our intentions. We can mean well, but because consequentialism looks at results and just the outcomes to measure whether an action is good or not, is right or not, intentions are not part of that calculation. So their consequentialists are aware of that, and they have a particular way that they talk about the morality of intentions. Okay, and then finally, not finally, sorry, I have another point. Know the scope of the moral community. This comes into play where he discusses Jeremy Bentham and the principle that utilitarians use as to whether someone is a member of the moral community, and it's very simple. Can we suffer? Can the individual suffer? If the individual can suffer, then that individual is a member of the moral community. And so think about who and what that might encompass. And you can begin to see why consequentialism is actually a very demanding moral theory, because the moral community tends to be quite broad. The scope of the moral community is quite broad in consequentialism. So have a look at that section carefully, please. And then now lastly, in chapter 10, so this is the second chapter in the readings, is you want to understand the problem of injustice, or problems of injustice. You want to look at that section very, very carefully, as well as the potential solutions that consequentialism offers for the problems of injustice, because this is the most serious problem with the ethical theory, with consequentialism. And so you want to look at, how consequentialism deals with this objection from, hey, your theory does not emphasize and regard justice with the moral credit it deserves and needs. And so consequentialists have answers to that. So I want you to look at what those problems are and then how consequentialists answer them. All right, so that's consequentialism. Now let's move to the Kantian perspective. And you have 2 chapters here, and what the author kind of breaks form here in the Kantian chapter, because what he does is he interweaves the objections to the Kantian perspective within the chapters. In the other theories, when he presents them, he usually does like, okay, here's the advantage, here's the positive case for the theory, here's the kinds of problems that it solves, here's the benefits of that position, and looks at those arguments. But then he has a follow-up chapter where he looks at the disadvantages and the problems of that theory. So just be aware that in the 2 chapters on Kant, that he is breaking form, and what he does is he talks about the objections and the problems with Kantian theory within the chapters where he's also talking about what it actually says and some of the advantages of it. I think there's a very good reason for this. One is because the Kantian ethical theory is probably the most difficult to grasp. And part of that is because of the first item. It is that there are some unique terms. There's a vocabulary to Kantian ethical theory that is a barrier, or can be a barrier. And so what I want you to do is, and what I've done in the quiz, is I've designed at least 5 questions that are vocabulary specific. So it's like, if you understand those terms, then you're going to get the answer. So make sure that you understand the terms, the specific terms that are unique to, or common to, I should say, the Kantian perspective. And I gave you the list there on the slide. So look at those carefully. Then I want you to understand the principle of universalizability. That is a mouthful, but that is one of 2 principles in the Kantian perspective that your author discusses at length, and this is an important one. So the principle of universalizability helps us understand. It's a rule that helps us understand, what is morally, what are our moral duties, based on the actions that we propose to do. Okay, that was really badly put. Let me try that again. So we want to know whether a particular action that we want to undertake is morally permitted or not, or even morally required. And so what we have to do is we have to ask, can I do this action, this proposed action, and also live in a world where everyone else does the proposed action? So can I universalize this action so that everyone does it, or would that just create chaos? So this is why things like lying are particularly egregious, are morally forbidden in Kantian theory, is because if you universalize them, if you universalize lying, then all trust breaks down. There's no integrity to be found, and the society can't function. So we cannot remain morally neutral then about lying, or we can't even remain morally neutral about anything, about any action, proposed action that is not universalizable. Okay, so look carefully at that. Next, review the morality and rationality section. So this is a really important section in the reading, because this is where the author develops how reason, human reason, is central to the Kantian perspective. And although human reason is essential to all ethical theory and theorizing, in the Kantian perspective, so much of the justification for his principles and for his maxims comes as a result of the power and the dignity of human reason, that it's absolutely central to understand, how morality and rationality are connected in Kant's perspective. So look carefully at that section. I have at least 3 or 4 or 5 questions that come from that section. Okay, next is the principle of humanity, and so this is in chapter 12. And in the principle of humanity, this is where we talk about, and this by the way builds on the idea of human rationality. That is the source of human dignity, and so that is why all human beings must be treated as ends in themselves and never as a means. So I can never use people, right? I can never mistreat others for my own gain, for my own benefit. And this is also a key principle in Kantian ethics: is you can't treat people as means to your ends or any other ends, someone else's ends, a party's ends, or an idea's ends, because humans are ends in themselves. They are essentially infinitely valuable, and if you treat people as means to an end, then you are degrading those individuals. Okay, so that is a very important principle in the Kantian perspective, and connects his ethical theory with rationality. Okay, and then I just wanted to alert you to the latter half of chapter 12, which is these 5 problems of this particular principle, the principle of humanity. So there's a lengthy discussion there, starting on pages 181, and you are not required to know that section for the sake of the quiz, because I have not drawn any questions from it. So you're welcome to skip over that if you wish. I know it's a lot of reading. Just jump to the conclusion in that section, in that chapter, and call it done. So yeah, that's it, folks. That's your list of things to look for in chapters 8 on ethical egoism, chapters 9 and 10 on consequentialism, and chapters 11 and 12 on the Kantian perspective. And if you've caught this broadcast either live or you're watching the replay, then this is where you want to pay attention to the heads up that I've given you about some of the specific questions that are going to be on the quiz. I did that in the last video, and sure enough, there were a few questions explicitly that I, answered for you in the video that were on quiz 2. So I've done the same thing here on quiz 3. So be aware of that, and hopefully this is going to be helpful to you. I want to see that quiz average continue to move up. I'm sure it will. And good luck on the reading. But again, if you have any questions at all about the material that we've covered, if you have any questions about stuff that I've said about quiz 2 on the autopsy, just any general fears or worries or concerns that you have, just fire off a message to me, let me know, and I'd be glad to talk with you about it. So for those of you still here, I guess you've hung in for this whole time or most of it. If you have any questions, I can pause here for a minute and see if you want to ask me a question. If you're still tuned in, hopefully our connection has been better today. I've not seen any serious glitches, at least a couple of little hiccups, but nothing like last time. So, are there any questions from those of you here? All right, gang. Well, if you think of some, thank you for the hearts. Appreciate that. Glad I take that as this was helpful. I hope it was. I want to see you all succeed on this. So again, if you have any questions about anything I've said in this broadcast or other ones, let me know. And if you have any other things that you want to talk about about the readings for this week, I'd be glad to go over that with you. Otherwise, best of luck to you, and I will catch you next week. See you.